What's up, guys? Dr. Seth back to help you solve your powerlifter problems. And on today's edition of Don't Be a Nerd, we're going to find out if your total sucks because you are too flexible. So, is stretching stupid? And this one is a big one because every powerlifter influencer wants to say, stretching's a waste of time, don't stretch, stretching's dumb, stretching makes you weak, stretching is useless. And then all of their followers are like, oh, they said stretching's bad, they must be so smart. And then it gets a fucking bazillion views and everyone's like, rah, let's not stretch ever again. And that's pretty damn wrong. So, we are going to get into the arguments against stretching and why they are shitty arguments. Now, with that said, before we get started, we are powerlifters. We are doing a sport that does not require very much flexibility, and by the nature of our training and how most of our training is through a partial range of motion, we're not going to be very flexible humans. And this is by no means saying that you need to be a gymnast to powerlift well. Like, hell, you guys see me move. I'm not super flexible. But what I am is flexible enough to get into the positions that I need to get into in order to lift. And when I feel like some of those positions are going away, I do specific flexibility training for those positions so that I can still get into them and use them and I do not lose them and I'm not forced into some shitty, can't get the bar on my back deal or like can't reach the deadlift bar or can't touch a bench. I mean, I can't touch a bench right now, but that is a very different reason. So let's get into this sucker because this shit is fun for me. So, arguments against stretching. Stretching is only neurological. It doesn't make the tissue longer. Stretching will make you weaker. Strength training is better than stretching for creating range of motion. We've all heard that stuff. We've all seen it posted. I probably see it posted too much because I pay attention to things that annoy me because I like causing myself misery. Don't do that. So, here we go. Is stretching only neurological? So the big problem with this is that to be a stretch, the very definition of a stretch is that tissue must elongate. It must get longer. So if stretching was only neurological and the changes in access were only neurological, if we see an increase in range of motion following the stretch or an increase in flexibility, the tissue has to get longer in order for, where's the fucking screen? If that's as far as I can extend my elbow because of brachialis tightness and I stretch it for 30 seconds and I can extend my elbow that far, to extend my elbow that much further, the tissue will have had to have gotten longer in order to do that. So even if the changes were only up here, there would need to be some degree of structural change necessary to go from here being end range of motion to here being end range of motion. So that is automatically debunked, argument shittered, totally done, does not work. So there's going to be people though that go, but Seth, studies have shown that there is no change to muscular architecture following stretching programs. And what we got to do is, yes, those studies do exist. There are tons of them. Go Google Scholar that shit. I'm too lazy to do it for you because I've already read them. So those studies, they exist. There are also studies that exist that show that muscles have both gotten longer. So like sarcomeres in series, the muscle fibers have gotten longer. That has changed with stretching programs. There have also been studies showing that there is conventional hypertrophy that occurs, so like more sarcomeres stacked side by side with stretching programs. And what we gotta think is when we see studies that say stretching doesn't change muscle architecture, when we see studies that say stretching does change muscle architecture, what we gotta do is we gotta look at what the fuck are the methods in these studies. What are they doing to either produce changes or not produce changes? And what we can begin to see is that in the studies where the stretching intensity is low, the duration is low, the volume through the week is low, the total length of the study is low, where they're not doing very much actual stretching, change doesn't occur. Duh, if you are not doing enough to create a stimulus big enough to generate an adaptation, you will not get that structural adaptation. It's the same thing as muscle hypertrophy. If you do not train hard enough to generate a big enough stimulus to create the adaptation where the muscle is going to grow, you're not going to see that growth. In the studies where stretch duration is high, stretch intensity is high, volume per week is on the higher side, study duration is longer so that those changes can actually have time to take place, then we begin to see structural changes in muscle architecture. So no, stretching, although it does have a neurological component where we are able to access more length, the changes are not purely neurological, depending on how the stretch is performed in terms of creating change at the muscle architecture and how things work. So, next fun one, does stretching make you weaker? And again, there are a ton of studies that show if we do a high intensity stretch prior to exertion, that force production is reduced. And if we think, again, like what is a high intensity stretch? We're taking something to end range and holding it there and really cranking into it to the point where the thing is going to be like, it's basically an end range isometric contraction at that point. You do that, you are going to be fatigued, performance will be reduced. No shit, Sherlock. And if we're relating that to something that lifters will know, if you know Dante Trudell, if you know dog crap training, you will know that a big component of that system is to do very, very high intensity stretches between your sets. One, he's doing that because the stretching can generate muscle hypertrophy, and that kind of goes back to the previous argument. But when you do that, when you do DC training, when you do those high intensity stretches between your sets, you will notice that you freaking get your ass kicked because it becomes exceptionally hard to train after that high intensity stretch because the stretch is fatiguing. So yes, if you're doing dog crap training, you will get weaker in that session because of the intensity of your stretching. But again, if we look at other studies on flexibility that are done in the way that any performance-minded coach with the knowledge and flexibility would actually ask their athletes to stretch, if we have like a short duration, low to moderate intensity done prior to exercise as part of your warm-up, performance is not negatively impacted. If we have higher intensity, higher duration done away from training, so like say I stretch on a Tuesday and I train on the Wednesday or the Thursday, that stretch on the Tuesday isn't going to screw up my Wednesday or my Thursday. And even coming back to the whole idea that if you get flexible, like the muscles are going to be lax and the muscles are not going to be whatever, the changes in muscle length, as those structural changes happen, that is going to be slow. As those changes happen, your nervous system will have time to adapt to those changes and shit is still going to work very, very, very well. Now, sidebar, does being more flexible take away from the stretch reflex? And this is a gross oversimplification of stretch reflex, so don't yell at me for that. But bottom line, you don't need to be at end range of motion for a stretch reflex to occur. Like say I'm doing a dumbbell curl, where's the camera? There we go. With this water bottle, this very heavy water bottle, if I'm lowering it and I stop it here, that dumbbell is going to still want to keep going downwards. My bicep, when I put on the brakes myself, the muscle fibers, the alpha motor fibers, they are going to be contracting still. They're going to be shortening, but because the weight of the dumbbell is going to be trying to carry my arm down, the elastic components of the muscle and the gamma motor neurons in the muscle spindles, those are still going to get tugged on and lengthened. So because the spindles are lengthening, the alpha motor neurons are trying to contract and get shorter, the spindles are changing length at a different rate relative to the big contracting muscle fibers. That shit is still going to generate a stretch reflex. And say you're doing a squat. Everyone who isn't a super heavyweight, well, maybe not everyone, but the vast majority of y'all that are not super heavyweights, squat depth isn't end range of motion for your squat. So you should know this already intuitively, because if your squat depth is not your end range of motion, you can still put on the brakes hard and get good rebound out of the bottom and get a stretch reflex generated without needing to be at your end range of motion. So if we get more flexible, yes, it will change where end range of motion is, but it isn't going to change our ability to generate a stretch reflex because of the relationship between muscle spindles and the actual contractile fibers of the muscle. So again, debunked. Is strength training better than stretching for increasing flexibility? So what we first got to get into is the classifications of stretching. We can classify stretching based on the motion involved, whether we're moving, whether we're not moving, dynamic is moving, static, not moving, and based on the type of contraction involved, whether we are relaxed during the stretch or whether we are contracting against the stretch. If we are relaxed, that's going to be a passive stretch. If we are contracting, that is going to be an active stretch. So what we realize is that strength training towards the limits of a range of motion, towards getting a stretch sensation, strength training with the intent of lengthening muscle to create range of motion change, that is an active dynamic stretch. Strength training done in the way that can promote flexibility is actually a stretch. So saying that strength training is better than stretching, it's like if you're doing it to get a stretch, you're still stretching. So argument is nullified. It's still a stretch. Now, if we kind of want to go towards the road of is strength training better than static stretching, that's where like maybe we could get a little bit more ground because we know that strength training can influence our flexibility. We know that if we do strength training in a way that is a stretch by definition, it's that active dynamic stretch, that can increase range of motion. But is it better than static stretching for increasing range of motion? And there was a study that came out in 2021 that got all of the anti-stretch people's panties in a giant bunch because the preprint title was called Strength Training is as effective as stretching for improving range of motion, a systematic review and meta-analysis. Now, what we got to realize is that that was a preprint. After going through peer review and actually getting published as a journal article, the title and a lot of the points made in the article were changed due to the peer review process because the people doing the peer review were like, hey, a lot of this can't really be concluded from what we looked at in the study. A lot of this wasn't supported by the studies that your meta-analysis pulled from. So the title then became Strength Training versus Stretching for Improving Range of Motion. So it went from strength training is as effective to strength training is versus. So what we can gather from those two titles, go Google the articles, go Google Afonso 21, Strength Training versus Stretching. You should be able to find both versions of the article if you want to look at it for yourself. But it went from strength training being as effective, not better, in the title that was taken back, to strength training versus. And the reason it went to strength training versus is that they realized that static stretching is better for creating absolute range of motion than strength training. And again, that doesn't mean that we can't use strength training to get more flexible. It's just that if we static stretch, we have the potential to create more range of motion in the absolute sense. Now, I say in the absolute sense because what we also got to think about with stretching is that flexibility is specific to our joints, the tissues involved, and the speed and force at which those joints and tissues are moving with. So if we want flexibility generated by static stretching to carry over well to our lifting, we then need to lift with that range of motion in order to solidify it under our control so we can actually use it. If we want flexibility from static stretching to transfer over to a karate kick, we should be doing some more high-speed dynamic stuff to get it to translate that way. So static stretching is what I would consider like if we want to make flexibility happen, static stretching is kind of like the base of the pyramid. And then depending on what we want that stretch to translate towards, what we want that range to translate towards, then we can think about how can we train with this range in order to get it to transfer to the thing that we were trying to get it to transfer to. So if we are stretching, what's the way to apply it intelligently for a powerlifter? So if you find yourself having trouble to get under the squat bar on a day, or like you feel like you're jacked up in range of motion at the bottom of the bench, and you need to train that day, you're training squats, you're training bench, you're training something where you feel like, oh shit, I didn't realize it, but I am missing range of motion. That way, if in that situation, you can run a short duration, low to moderate intensity, static or dynamic stretch, and you should be able to get a little bit more range there to help you get through that session well. If you want to work on your range of motion away from the gym, you can do longer duration, higher intensity static stretching, and that should help you create more range of motion that you can then use in training to help solidify it. If you want to use your training in order to actually train flexibility, if we want to kind of kill two birds with one stone, we can then train with the intent of generating a stretch, and we should notice range of motion gains from that. So that is how we can apply stretching in a nutshell and how we can apply stretching intelligently. And the last thing that I want to get into, that I actually didn't make a slide for because I didn't realize I wanted to get into it until I was at this point of filming the video, is the idea that stretching does not influence pain. And again, if we look at studies on the relationship between stretching and pain, we can see that stretching does have the effect of reducing pain in some situations. And that is going to come down to dosage, intensity, and what we are doing the stretch for. And what we gotta remember with pain is that what pain ultimately boils down to is the brain perceiving threat in an area. So if we perceive like using our hamstring in a certain position as dangerous, or using a hamstring at end range as dangerous, or even using our hamstring at mid-range as being dangerous, we will then experience pain in that range. Now, what stretching does, if we were to lengthen the hamstring, what we're doing is we're applying force to the muscle to lengthen it. When we do that, we are going to apply force to the mechanoreceptors in the muscle. We're going to apply force to the nociceptors in the muscle. We are going to apply force to the things that send signals from that muscle back up to our big old brain. And if we are able to do that at a dosage that we can perceive as safe, over time, we can ramp up that dosage, and then we can become accustomed to it, and we can become accustomed to more length and more load, and that can then help us find our way out of pain if we dose stretching appropriately to the issue that we are dealing with. And the last point on that is going back to pain being the result of our brain's perceiving threat. It's not so much that the muscle being tight is causative of pain. More often than not, the tightness is a protective mechanism to try to prevent us from using the muscle in the way that would get us to perceive threat. So don't think that just because your muscles are tight, that is why you hurt. Think of your muscles being tight as another symptom related to the pain, not a cause, and that can then help you figure out how to use stretching in a way to actually improve pain symptoms. So, bottom line, don't be stupid. Stretching is not stupid if you understand how to use it and what is actually going on. Now, that's it. That's all I got. No more bonus things that I came up with halfway through the presentation. So, thank you guys for watching. Drop a like, drop a comment. Appreciate the hell out of you guys, because although it is challenging to grow a YouTube channel when all it is me sitting here yapping at you, growth has been awesome. I appreciate the hell out of you guys. And if you like this style of content, if you like what you're getting here, hop onto the link below, join up for the upcoming lecture series on bridging the gap between rehab and training, because that is going to be me getting in depth on what I do as my job to help you guys do a better job of it. Because when I'm dealing with athletes and their coaches, there is a huge disconnect between most of the coaches and the vast majority of the athletes in understanding how to effectively progress training. And rehab, in essence, is training. If we are trying to get this thing to feel better, what I need to do is progressively ask this pec to do more and more and more as it's able to handle more. And there really shouldn't be this light switch on off between whether we're training or whether we're not training. We need to then understand how the little like fluffy stuff I'm doing right now, how to get that to go towards bench pressing. We need to understand how to progress that. We need to understand at what rate we can progress it. We need to understand how we can progress movement complexity. We need to understand how we can progress loading. And by understanding how we can progress, we can make more intelligent decisions in that progression scheme so that the athlete has a much better chance of returning to performance. And the reason I'm so fired up about this, and the reason that I love this, is it is something that I had screwed up on so many friggin' times early in my lifting career. And by figuring this shit out, it transformed my lifting career to the point where right now it's like I can sit here and be like, I'm not worried about this because I know it's a non-issue. I know that I'm going to be able to scale things so that I can get back. Whereas when I blew up my knee, which got me into this pathway, I basically thought I was screwed, and going back to school and figuring stuff out was a last ditch effort to not have my career be over. And if I can pass that on to you guys so that you don't have to have a catastrophic injury and spend 4 years trying to figure shit out, sidebar, school was not the answer to figure that out, but I want to save you guys the scars by teaching you the lessons that I learned. So hop in on that series. Link will be below. Appreciate the hell out of you guys. It is going to be, for those of you who attended last year's lectures, it is a total revamp because I realized the mistakes that I made while doing it last year to make it run smoother and make more sense and be easier to apply to your own shit. So hop in there. This is for athletes. This is for coaches. This is for clinicians. I'm not going to be doing like this is how a coach can be a physical therapist, because I also hate that, because that is not good for both the athlete and the coach from a legal perspective and from a making shit work well perspective. But I want to show coaches how to take someone from a physical therapist once they are cleared and get them all the way back to where they need to be. So, sale pitch over. Hop on if you want to hop on. Don't hop on if you don't want to hop on, because I'll keep on doing these because it is fun to get into. Peace out. Thank you guys again for sticking around. See ya later.